I want to ask you something. When did you last consciously unclench your jaw? Not because something stressful was happening, just when did you last notice it was tight and actively let it go? For a long time, I didn't notice mine at all. It would be tight for hours, sometimes the whole day, and I'd only become aware of it when something made me consciously relax it. And in that moment, I'd realised that it had been clenched for I don't know how long, and that wasn't an occasional thing, that was my baseline. So in this episode, I want to talk about what chronic low-grade stress is actually doing in the body, specifically what it does to the HPA axis, the cortisol system, and your circadian rhythm as well. Not because I have a neat story about how I fixed it, because I definitely don't. The circumstances of my life that create the load are still there, but understanding what was happening in my nervous system changed my relationship with it in ways that made a real difference for me. And the tools that I found, some of them quite unusual, I think are worth sharing. So if you're new here, welcome. I'm Frances Norgate, a certified nutrition and lifestyle advisor, a member of the Federation of Holistic Therapists, and an ambassador for the Public Health Collaboration, a charity based in the UK. And I'm also someone who's been on a very long journey with my own nervous system regulation, not someone who solved it and is reporting back from the other side. And a quick thing if you're new here, I work at the intersection of circadian biology and nutrition, and most of what I cover comes back to one idea, and that is that your body needs the right signals at the right times. And today is about one of the most powerful disruptors of those signals, and one of the least talked about as well. So start at episode 1 if you want the full foundation, but you don't need that for this episode. Now, just to start a little bit with my story, we homeschool our 2 daughters. I also work and study. I'm currently completing my BSc in nutritional therapy alongside the podcast, the client work, and everything else as well. And my life doesn't involve any commutes or anything like that. It doesn't have a sort of handover or that school run that transitions one context to another, or a moment in the day when someone else takes over and there's a clear line there where I'm off duty. I don't have anything like that. And some of this, I have to say, is a genuine privilege. I chose it and I love it most of the time. But one of the things it means is that the boundary between work and home, between thinking hard and being a present parent, between concentration and availability is extremely porous and often non-existent as well. And the hardest version of this is when the 2 worlds collide at their most demanding times. So when I'm in the middle of doing something that requires real depth, like deep research or critical analysis for my studies, working through a complex client case, and then at the same time, a child needs something, or more specifically, when my 2 daughters are fighting. Because for me, the bickering is the thing that gets to me the most. I want to be honest about that. Noise and interruption in general are hard, and I use these loop earplugs when things get too loud, which helps. But conflict between my 2 daughters, the back and forth of it, the escalation, the sound of it, that activates something in me that other kinds of noise doesn't. And it lands differently, and it's harder for me to absorb. And I noticed over time that my nervous system was responding to small things as if they were big threats. A sudden loud noise, an interruption at a difficult moment, a minor logistical problem that should have been easy. My response to that, initially, even when I managed it well on the outside, was out of proportion to the thing that was happening. Like there was some sort of volume setting that had been turned up and I hadn't found the knob to turn it back down. And then my jaw was part of this picture, so I'd carry tension in it for hours without being aware of it. Not related to any specific event, just tight constantly as a kind of baseline. And I noticed this most when I consciously relaxed it, so that sudden release and then the realization that I'd been holding it like that for who knows how long. I also carried it in my shoulders, so like a kind of permanent slight bracing, like something might be coming. And the gut symptoms I mentioned in earlier episodes as well were part of it too. And I understand now that a lot of what I attributed to food was also nervous system and the gut and brain communicating their shared state of alertness. And underpinning all of it was something that's hard to describe, but which I think a lot of women will recognize as well. So I couldn't fully remember the last time I felt genuinely relaxed, not just not stressed, but like genuinely at ease. And that kind of state had become unfamiliar enough to me that when I tried to access it, something in me didn't quite know how, and it kind of felt wrong as well. So I started looking into the nervous system research, not through the circadian lens initially, but because I was seeing it become more widely discussed and I was curious whether it could explain what I was experiencing. And then the HPA axis piece came up, and suddenly I had language for something that had been happening in my body for years without a name. So let me explain what I found. The HPA axis, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal, three structures working together as your body's primary stress response system. Well, here's how it works in the acute version, the version it was designed for. So something threatening happens to you and your hypothalamus detects it and sends a signal to the pituitary gland. The pituitary signals the adrenal glands to release cortisol. And then cortisol mobilizes energy, sharpens attention, prepares you to respond. And then when the threat passes, a feedback loop tells the hypothalamus to stand down. And cortisol drops and the system returns back to baseline. And that's how we were designed to be, or how we evolved to be. And it's elegant and it works extremely well for the kind of stresses humans evolved with, which are physical threats, short duration, clear resolution. The problem is that modern stress doesn't work like that. So the things that activate the HPA axis today are rarely single events with clear resolutions. They're ongoing and relentless in the most literal sense. They don't relent. So the mental load that never empties, the financial concern that sits in the background, the responsibility for small people who need things constantly, the study deadline and the client case and the children bickering, all of that at the same time. And when stresses are chronic and unresolved, the HPA axis doesn't get the stand down signal. So cortisol doesn't return to baseline cleanly, it stays slightly elevated, or it becomes dysregulated. Sometimes too high, sometimes too low, but rarely running in its natural clean arc. And this is where the circadian connection becomes crucial. So cortisol is a circadian hormone. It's a natural pattern. We have a peak at waking, we have gradual decline through the day, and then we have low cortisol in the evening. And that's what sets the rhythm for your alertness, your digestion, your immune function, your sleep. But when the HPA axis is chronically activated, that pattern becomes completely distorted. And the cortisol that should be making a clean peak in the morning and a clean descent in the evening gets blurred and irregular. Your body clock loses one of its most important timing signals, which is why chronic stress and circadian disruption are so deeply entangled. They're not two separate problems. Chronic stress disrupts the circadian system. Circadian disruption makes the stress response less regulated, and each makes the other worse. And for women in perimenopause, for example, whose declining estrogen is already making the master body clock less robust, are particularly vulnerable to this compounding effect. And there's a concept in stress physiology called allostatic load. Allostasis is what your body does to maintain stability through change. It's the active, effortful process of adapting to demands. And allostatic load is the cumulative wear on the body from sustained adaptation, from the nervous system that never fully returns to baseline, from the cortisol that never quite cleans up, and from the jaw that stays tight because the background signal never fully turns off. And I found the allostatic load concept clarifying rather than alarming because it removed a layer of self-blame from what I was experiencing. My nervous system wasn't failing, it wasn't weak or broken. It was doing exactly what nervous systems do under sustained demand. So that's adapting, staying ready, keeping the system online. And the cost of that sustained readiness is what I was feeling in my jaw, my shoulders, my gut, my reactivity to sound, and so on. The question then becomes not how do I eliminate the demands, because most of them aren't going anywhere, but how do I give my nervous system enough genuine off time that it can regulate, repair, and meet the demands from a less depleted place? And this is where polyvagal theory becomes really useful because it gives a more nuanced map of the nervous system than the simple stress on, stress off binary most of us learned. So the polyvagal framework describes three states of the autonomic nervous system. The ventral vagal state, the social engagement system, is where we feel safe and connected and regulated. And this is where genuine rest lives. Then the sympathetic state is mobilization, so fight or flight, the activated stress response. And the dorsal vagal state is shutdown, so the freeze response, the immobilized collapse that happens under overwhelming or incapable threat. And most women under chronic load oscillate between sympathetic and something approaching the dorsal vagal, between activated and depleted, without spending very much time in the ventral vagal state at all. So the genuinely relaxed, genuinely safe feeling becomes unfamiliar because they're rarely there, which is exactly what I experienced, that inability to quite remember what genuinely at ease felt like. The vagus nerve is the physical pathway of the ventral vagal state. It runs from the brainstem through the heart, lungs, and the gut. And its tone, so its health and responsiveness, determines how well you can shift between states and how quickly you can return to regulation after activation. So low vagal tone means slower recovery from stress, more difficulty accessing the calm state, more reactivity, and higher vagal tone means better regulation, faster recovery, and more resilience. And vagal tone can be trained, so this is one of the most practically useful things I've come across in the nervous system research, and it connects directly to some of the practices that I had already started doing as well. So let me tell you what I actually do. It's not really a protocol, but as a set of things that I found genuinely help, and which the research has since helped me understand why. So the first thing that I do, and the one that connects most directly to everything I've covered across this series, is getting morning light. I say this over and over again, but getting outside within an hour of waking every single day. I've talked about this in the context of circadian rhythm and the cortisol curve. And what I want to address here is the nervous system layer. So outdoor morning light doesn't just set the body clock. There's a growing body of research on photobiomodulation, which is the effects of specific wavelengths on biological processes, showing that natural sunlight, particularly in the morning, has direct effects on mitochondrial function, on inflammatory markers, and on the nervous system itself. The near-infrared wavelengths in natural sunlight penetrate tissues and appear to support cellular energy production in ways that go beyond just the circadian signal. So being in actual sunlight, not just daylight, but sun on skin, feels different to being in the shade. And there's definitely a reason for that. The second thing is grounding or earthing, if you've heard of that. So the practice of direct physical contact with the earth. So it could be bare feet on the grass, on the soil, on the sand, or even touching a tree. There's research on this that I find really interesting, particularly around the electrical connection between the human body and the earth's surface. So the earth carries a mild negative charge, and when you're in direct contact with it, free electrons transfer into the body, which appears to have anti-inflammatory and autonomic nervous system effects. Studies have shown changes in cortisol patterns, heart rate variability, and inflammatory markers from consistent grounding practice. And the research is still developing. I want to be honest about that, but the effect is real enough that I notice it myself. And when I'm in a state of overwhelm and I can't leave the children, I go into the garden with bare feet. So I have the grass under my feet, I have sunshine if there is any, and a few minutes of just that, and something shifts for me, and I can really, really feel that, and the research actually helps me understand why. Now, I'm fortunate enough that I can walk out my back door into nature, and I have a garden, and I live in a rural area, so the countryside is right here. I know not everyone has access to that, but even grass in a small garden or a park or just a patch of soil somewhere definitely counts, and the direct contact is what matters. The third thing is breath work, and specifically 4-7-8 breathing, which is inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 7, and exhaling for 8 counts. And the extended exhale is the key mechanism here. So the exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest branch, the vagal pathway. A longer exhale than inhale tells the nervous system it's safe to downregulate. It's one of the fastest and most reliable ways to shift the autonomic state, not by suppressing the stress response, but by actively engaging the counter-regulatory system. The vagal tone piece connects here too. So slow, controlled breathing, particularly the extended exhale, is one of the most evidence-based ways to improve vagal tone over time as well. The heart rate variability research on this is solid. Consistent breathwork practice changes the responsiveness of the vagus nerve in ways that make the nervous system more resilient and faster to recover from activation. Now, I don't do this as a formal practice every day or anything, but when I notice the jaw or when I've just absorbed a particularly demanding situation, the 4-7-8 breathing is the first thing that I would reach for. The fourth thing is nature walks. So when I can, when there's someone to watch the children or when I can bring them, getting out into actual nature rather than just outdoors is really helpful. It doesn't have to be exercise specifically, though that's definitely a benefit as well. Just the combination of natural light, natural sound, physical movement, and the specific sort of sensory environment of a natural setting. And there's research on what the Japanese call shinrin-yoku, which is forest bathing, showing measurable changes in cortisol, blood pressure, and immune markers from time in natural environments. So the effect isn't just relaxation, it's biological regulation. And I also use those loop earplugs as well. And this is a practical adaptation rather than a healing practice, but it's worth mentioning honestly. So noise sensitivity is something that I still work with. So when the environment's too much, too loud, too many overlapping demands, too many people talking at the same time, that sort of thing, the earplugs definitely reduce the sensory load enough that I can stay regulated without leaving. So they're not a solution to the underlying sensitivity, they're just kind of a way of managing the inputs so my nervous system isn't fighting in too many fronts at the same time. And what the circadian work specifically contributed to all of this, and I want to be clear about what changed and what didn't for me, was the physical platform. So the gut symptoms reduced significantly, the fatigue, the morning and afternoon tiredness improved, the eczema cleared, I started feeling tired at the right time in the evening rather than wired and then suddenly flat. Then the physical state of my body became more stable. And when the physical platform is more stable, the nervous system has more capacity. So the same demands land differently when you're rested than when you're depleted. And for me, the bickering between the children is still hard. The interruption during deep work are still really hard. But my nervous system meets them from a less depleted place than it did before. So that distinction between changing the circumstances and changing your capacity to meet them is the most honest thing I can tell you about this. So I haven't eliminated the stress. I've improved the ground that I'm standing on when it arrives. And then there's one more layer to add as well, specifically for women in perimenopause or approaching it. Estrogen has a moderating effect on the HPA axis, so it helps regulate the stress response, not eliminate it, but putting a kind of buffer around it. And when estrogen levels are adequate, the cortisol response to stressors tend to be more proportionate, more cleanly resolved, and faster to return to baseline. But when estrogen starts to decline in perimenopause, that buffer reduces, the same stressors produce a larger cortisol response, and then recovery becomes slower, the nervous system becomes more reactive. So you might experience things like being more sensitive to noise, more easily overwhelmed, less able to shift back into a regulated state after activation and that sort of thing. And what felt manageable when you were younger often tends to start feeling like it's too much in your 40s, for example. Not because your circumstances have necessarily changed or your resilience has declined, but because the hormonal buffer that was quietly modulating your stress response is no longer as robust. This is why noise sensitivity and emotional reactivity that many women notice as we get older isn't a psychological problem, it's more of a hormonal and neurological one. So the nervous system is operating with less buffering, the same signal is hitting harder, and the circadian piece compounds this further as well. So declining estrogen makes the master body clock less stable, and chronic HPA activation disrupts the cortisol pattern that the body clock depends on, and disrupted sleep reduces the restoration that regulates both stress and circadian function. And these are not separate problems, they are one interconnected system, and they need to be addressed as such. which is why I keep coming back to the foundations, which are morning light, consistent wake time, earlier eating, evening darkness, as the place to start, not because they're the only thing that matters, but because they stabilize the ground on which everything else depends. And a more stable circadian rhythm means a more regulated HPA axis. A more regulated HPA axis means a more resilient nervous system, and a more resilient nervous system means more capacity to meet the demands that aren't going anywhere. I want to end this episode with something I wish someone had told me earlier. The state of chronic low-grade activation, the jaw that's been tight for hours without you noticing, the readiness that never quite becomes rest, the reactivity to small things that you feel you should be able to absorb more easily, that's not a character flaw. It's not poor stress management. It's what happens when a nervous system has been operating under sustained demand for long enough that the baseline shifts upward. So the body's learned to stay ready and it's doing its job. And understanding that doesn't make the demand smaller. You're still going to have your life's demands. You're still going to have your children or your work or whatever you're doing. The work's still going to need doing and the mental load's not going anywhere. But understanding what's happening biologically, the HPA axis, the cortisol pattern, the vagal tone, the way the circadian disruption and the stress response compound each other, often changes how you relate to it. You stop interpreting the reactivity as failure and start interpreting it as information. You start asking not why can't I handle this better, but what does my nervous system need right now to come back to regulation? And the answers to that question turn out to be things that you can actually do. So it could be feet on grass, 4 counts in, 7 hold and 8 out, or sunlight on your face in the morning, a walk in actual nature, the conditions that tell your nervous system genuinely that it's safe to stand down. And I'm still working on this. I want to be clear about that. It's not a story with a tidy resolution at all, but I understand what's happening in my body now in a way that I didn't before. And understanding has changed more than I expected it to. So we've now had 12 episodes. We've had light, timing, nutrition, sleep, perimenopause, the cortisol curve, sleep architecture, and now the nervous system. And these aren't separate topics at all. They're different angles on the same system, and understanding how they fit together in sequence for your specific situation is exactly what the Quantum Nourishment Masterclass is about. So you can get that for free at francesnorgate.com/masterclass if you would like it. And next week, we're moving on to something that I've been looking forward to covering for a while now, which is the relationship between light and hormones more specifically. Not just the circadian angle we've already covered, but the direct effects of light on estrogen, progesterone, and thyroid function, and what the research from quantum biology is starting to show about why sunlight might be one of the most underrated hormonal interventions available. And that's going to be really interesting, so I hope you tune in to listen. But for now, thank you so much for being here. Take care, and I'll see you next week.